If you're saving 10% of your income for retirement, there's a real chance you're building toward a number that comes up short. Not by a little, but by hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the math isn't subtle. This isn't about your investing choices or which account you're using. It's about the benchmark you're measuring yourself against. 10% became the default because someone at some point decided it was the right amount. The question worth asking is whether they ran that calculation in a world that looks anything like the one you're living in. The answer for most people today is that they didn't. The rule survived, the assumptions behind it didn't. By the end of this video, you'll understand where the 10% rule came from, why both Fidelity and Vanguard have revised their guidance above it, and how to run a simple check on whether your current rate is calibrated to your actual situation. This isn't an argument for dramatic sacrifice or an alarm about how far behind you are. It's a case for looking at the number with clear eyes. Because most people are following a rule without knowing when it was written or what it was written for. The 10% rule didn't emerge arbitrarily. It came out of an era when retirement was structured differently in almost every way that matters. Employer pensions were standard, which meant a significant portion of retirement income was guaranteed, regardless of what the market did. Social Security was a newer and more robust program relative to average wages, designed to replace somewhere between 50 and 60% of pre-retirement income for a middle-income earner. Life expectancy after reaching retirement age was shorter. A 65-year-old in the 1960s could expect to live roughly 13 to 15 more years. Retirement was a 15-year budget problem. Housing also consumed a smaller share of take-home pay, which meant more income was available for savings in the first place. The 10% rule made reasonable assumptions within that context. A pension floor, a meaningful Social Security replacement rate, a shorter runway to fund, and a lower cost of living relative to income. Strip any one of those assumptions away and the number starts to shift. Strip all of them, and you're working from a rule that was never designed for the situation most people face today. Here's what changed. First, the employer pension has largely disappeared. Less than 15% of private sector workers have a traditional, defined benefit pension today. The income floor that the 10% rule leaned on, the guaranteed monthly check that didn't depend on how much you personally saved, is gone for the overwhelming majority of working people. What you don't save is now what you don't have. Second, Social Security replaces a smaller share of pre-retirement income than it once did, particularly for people earning around or above the median. For someone with a consistent working history at around $74,000 a year, Social Security might replace somewhere between 35 and 40% of that income. In earlier decades, the replacement rate was more generous. The benefit formula hasn't kept pace with the divergence between wages and the cost of living. Third, and this is the part that shifts the math most significantly, retirement is longer. A 30-year-old today can reasonably plan for 20 to 30 years past retirement. That's not a 15-year funding problem. It's a 25-year one. The math changes accordingly. A sustainable withdrawal rate is generally estimated at around 4% per year. To generate $47,000 annually from savings alone, roughly 63% of the median income, you need approximately $1,173,000 saved. That's not a wealth target. That's a minimum adequacy threshold, and 10% of median income compounded over a realistic career doesn't reliably reach it. Let me show you the actual numbers. Take someone earning $74,580 per year, close to the current US median. At a 10% savings rate, that's $7,458 going into retirement accounts annually. If they start at 32 and retire at 65, they have 33 years of compounding. At a 7% average annual return, they accumulate roughly $875,000 by retirement. That sounds substantial. But here's the variable that matters most and gets overlooked most: inflation. At a 3% annual rate, $875,000 in 2059 has the purchasing power of about $325,000 in today's dollars. That's the real number. And at a 4% withdrawal rate, it generates $13,000 a year from savings. Social Security might add another $26,000 or so, assuming a full career at current benefit structures. Combined, that's approximately $39,000 per year in retirement income. before healthcare costs, which tend to rise sharply after 70. Now, run the same scenario at 15%. The same person, same income, same return assumptions, saving $11,187 per year over 33 years builds to roughly $1.31 million nominal. Inflation adjusted to today's purchasing power, that's approximately $489,000. Combined with Social Security, that's a meaningfully different retirement. Not wealthy, but stable, with margin for the unexpected. The gap between 10 and 15% on that income comes to about $3,729 per year, roughly $311 per month. That's a real number in budget terms, but compounded over 33 years, it's the difference between a retirement that requires constant rationing and one that doesn't. 5 percentage points of additional rate produces roughly 50% more purchasing power in the outcome. The way I think about it, this trap catches people at two distinct moments. The first is in your late 20s or early 30s, when you set up a workplace retirement account for the first time. You contribute enough to capture the employer match, which often puts you in the 8 to 10% range. You feel like you've handled it and you don't revisit the number for years. It feels like the responsible amount because nobody informed you the benchmark had moved. Consider someone who's 28, earning $61,000, contributing 10%, $6,100 a year. If they increase to 15%, $9,150. The additional $3,050 per year invested for 37 years at 7% adds approximately $592,000 to their final balance. That shift costs about $254 per month in take-home pay. It produces 6 figures of additional retirement security. The cost is real, so is the outcome. The second moment is the early 40s, when the gap becomes harder to ignore and harder to close. Someone at 42 with $87,000 in retirement savings, near the national median for that age group, earning $82,000 and saving at 10%, is already behind the pace needed for a stable retirement. Getting back on track would require raising the rate to somewhere between 18 and 20% for the remaining 23 working years. That's a harder adjustment to absorb, but it's a solvable problem. What tends to delay the fix isn't the math or the money. It's the assumption, held for years without examination, that the original number was fine. So, where does this leave you in practical terms? Both Fidelity and Vanguard now place the recommended savings rate at 15% of gross income per year, including any employer match. That's the updated baseline. Not an aspirational target, not an aggressive posture, but the minimum the math supports for most people retiring without a pension. Fidelity's broader framework adds a milestone-based benchmark. Accumulate 10 times your income by the time you retire. By age 35, that means roughly 1 times your salary saved. By 45, 3 times. By 55, 7 times. Here's a simple pressure test worth running. Take your current annual savings, project it forward at 7% to your expected retirement age. Divide the result by 25. That gives you the annual income it can sustainably generate at a 4% withdrawal rate. Add a reasonable estimate for your Social Security benefit. Is the total within range of what you spend today? If it comes up short, the lever with the most direct impact right now isn't your fund selection. It's the percentage going in. Most of the variance in retirement outcomes comes not from which funds were chosen, but from how consistently and at what rate contributions were made. The 10% rule wasn't careless advice. When it was formulated, it fit the structure of the time. Employer pensions provided a guaranteed floor, Social Security replaced a higher share of pre-retirement income, and retirements were shorter. The math was calibrated for that world. The problem isn't that the advice was wrong. It's that the world it was written for changed significantly, and the advice didn't update with it. The revised number from the institutions that run the actuarial models is 15%. The shift from 10 to 15 isn't dramatic, but it's the difference between a rule calibrated to the retirement landscape as it exists now and one calibrated to a version of it that no longer does. The question worth sitting with isn't whether 10% was ever reasonable. It's whether it's reasonable for the specific retirement you're heading toward. With the pension structure, the life expectancy, and the cost of living that apply to your actual life. If you want to understand how your emergency fund and your investment contributions interact, which one gets funded first, and when that order changes, there's a video on this channel that works through that sequence directly. It's linked below. And if this one clarified something that's felt vague for a while, the next one might do the same.